Tall Tale TV.
Of Monsters and Mushrooms by Lesley Herron. Chapter 16, Pawniless. Some smells transcend time and take your mind back to happy memories. The smell of pies in the oven, freshly cut grass, or even the smell of firewood crackling in the hearth. This smell, however, transcended reason, and, given enough time, might cause memory loss. Eric tried shifting his head to the side, hoping for at least one breath of fresh air, but all that did was alter the smell. He was strapped to the back of a short but extremely stout boar. His hands were tied with vine rope that went beneath the beast and secured to his ankles, assuring the maximum amount of discomfort. The smell of the creature, mighty as it was, paled in comparison to the smell coming from the baskets on either side of Eric. Mistaking him for unconscious, the pygmies had thrown Eric on the beast's back along with their fishing haul, and the sweltering heat was doing the catch no favors. The tiny creatures chatted in a hyper-dialogue, poking and prodding at him several times in the side with their fishing spears. He couldn't be sure what they were saying, but he assumed the gist of the conversation had something to do with being taken back to their camp. Eric chanced a peek at his surroundings after he was sure his captors would be too busy to notice he was awake. Attila and Brig, both still out cold, were being hauled along behind him. Attila was on a similar boar, small by their standards, but roughly the size of a rhino to the pygmies. Brig, being far too large for mere swine, was hogtied to the back of a massive animal that seemed to be one part hippo and one part crocodile. The brush and thicket around them was becoming increasingly dense, and the sound of water was gone. Eric figured they were being taken deeper into the heart of the forest. If it wasn't the giant goo monster that wanted to eat them, it was... No. No one had said they'd be on the dinner menu for these tiny people. Perhaps they had good intentions. Perhaps they only ate smelly fish. Eric slumped his head back down against the side of his pungent beast of burden, not buying his own optimism for a second. They were as good as deep fried. The boars broke through a barrier of vines and massive leaves and emerged into an impressive clearing. Eric's jaw dropped. A mistake, he realized, as he spat out a clump of musty pig hair. The creature turned as it was being led away, and Eric got a full view of the village. Well, perhaps city would be more of an appropriate term, say for the minute scale of it all. Tiny stone homes were nestled up against trees, scaling up them and disappearing into the canopy. A few even seemed to tunnel into the massive trunks themselves, winding in and out at odd intervals. There were farms with tiny crops and animal pens along the outskirts. There was even a cobblestone road that wound its way through the village. At the center of the town was a most impressive stone building rising up into the trees, each layer smaller than the next. It brought to mind faded pictures of an ancient Aztec culture. It was easily over 100 feet high and decorated with flowers, carvings, offerings, and gold. Eric sighed and closed his eyes. It wasn't the state of the stone structure that worried him, but the sacrificial table he just knew would be at the top. 2-foot-tall creatures wouldn't build something that large without a god involved.
"Where are we?"
Attila's groggy voice asked from somewhere behind him. Before Eric could answer, though, he and Attila were cut down from their beasts and forced into small wooden cages by several tiny pygmies. Eric slumped against the wall of his cramped quarters, which smelled of wild animal fur and dung. He listened to their captors chatting noisily with one another, poking and prodding at Brig as they tried to figure out where to put him. One of the creatures removed its mask. It had the face of a primate, like a monkey, completely covered in hair. It bared its teeth at the others, waved a spear in the air, and then held up its mask above the heads of the short crowd. The others fell in line. Okay, so this pygmy seemed to be in charge, or at least in charge of the fishing party. It's always good to know who holds the cards when in a dangerous situation. They appeared to have come to a decision and allowed Brig to remain outside of a cage, but tethered his hands and feet with a length of vine and rolled him along the ground to rest next to Attila's cage. As they attempted to sit the man up, he began to stir and slowly opened his eyes.
"Where are we?"
he asked, his eyes moving lazily across their surroundings.
Ha! I asked the same thing.
Attila reached through the bars and slapped Brig on the shoulder. The boss pygmy pointed at Brig, chattered some words, and then several new pygmies emerged from the gathering crowd. These ones wore bits of wooden armor in addition to their masks, and held nasty-looking spears that they all leveled in Brig's direction. The boss began speaking directly to Brig.
"I don't understand,"
Brig offered, shrugging a little as he watched their gestures. Attila shook his head.
Sorry, I only speak bug.
"I'm pretty sure it's telling you that the spears are poison-tipped, and if you try to move, they'll most likely kill you," Eric replied in a flat voice. The journey was really starting to wear on his optimism. Brig pulled a face at the thought of being immediately killed by small spears and tried to make himself as small as possible, which was by no means an easy feat. Attila thought and pondered for a moment, watching as the pygmies began to throw more wood on a bonfire. It wasn't until they were almost done erecting some sort of spit that he gave a nervous chuckle.
You know, this is about the time Val would usually show up and save us.
He moved to the other side of his cage to address Eric directly.
You think he'll save our bacon just like last time?
"Not likely,"
said an all-too-familiar and extremely irate voice. Eric looked around and then up. Hanging some 6 feet above him was a large, domed cage. His brother was slumped on his back, feet tangled in the vines near the top of the cage, and his arms folded over his chest.
"What? Huh? How?"
Eric stammered. Vel let out a dry smirk.
"Apparently, red isn't a great camouflage color."
"How long have you been here?" Eric asked, standing up to press his face against the bars of his cage. He was, despite the circumstances, extremely happy to see his brother alive.
"Pretty sure it's been 2 days, but it's hard to tell time in a place where the sun doesn't ever set,"
Vel replied. His voice was bored and almost disinterested.
Why haven't you escaped?
Attila asked, looking around.
And why are you up there?
"I did try to escape, but there are so many of them, it's like being swarmed by angry, spear-toting fire ants. I think they wanted to eat me as punishment, but got upset when they realized they couldn't."
Vel shrugged with a heavy sigh.
"And I'm up here because I broke the chief's mask when I punched him in the face."
Attila snorted a chuckle.
Classic Val.
They wanted to eat you?"
Brig asked, looking up.
"Mushrooms finally wore off, huh? It's about damn time,"
Val replied, shifting uncomfortably in his cage.
"Yeah, they wanted to eat me, and by the looks of that bonfire over there, I'd say they're getting ready to cook up you three."
But why?
Attila asked, glancing over at the blazing flames.
"I don't speak pygmy. I have no idea."
Eric slumped against his cage again. If his brother couldn't manage an escape by overpowering them, then their chances at freedom looked bleak.
"Attila, I don't really fancy being an entree,"
Brig pointed out in a nervous whisper.
"You got any sort of gadget in that poncho of yours that can help?"
Attila shook his head.
Not unless you think 6-month-old stale beef jerky could help.
"Beef jerky?"
Brig repeated, eyeing Attila.
"You been holding out on me?"
Unaware of his friend's comment, Attila put his hand to his chin.
We could poison them with it, but there's not enough for all of them.
Eric had opened his mouth to comment when a different thought crossed his mind.
"Hey, Vel, any chance Evan is still out there and could maybe, save us?"
Vel laughed bitterly.
I don't know about saving yuz, but I'll try convincing them to make it quick and painless.
"Evan? But..."
Eric started, but stopped when he saw that the small merc was being followed by a group of pygmies. He recognized the especially hairy one by the shape of its mask. It had been there on the riverbank when they had washed up. But the pygmy on Evan's other side, Eric didn't recall. It was shorter than most, and incredibly squat. He wore a loincloth made from several large flower petals and was almost buried beneath a staggering layer of gold and gemstone jewelry. He was also sporting a fancy headdress that was made from leaves and more gold, wrapped around Attila's hat.
Hey, my hat!
Attila cried out as soon as his gaze landed on the chief. His hand shot out from the cage, reaching uselessly for the headdress. The pygmy chief jumped back and began scolding Attila, and then Evan, and then back at Attila.
The chief says it's his hat, and you can't have it back.
Wait, you can understand them?
Eric asked.
Tell him to let us go.
Yeah, I can't really do that,
Evan said, moving closer to them.
The only reason I'm still alive is because the chief's daughter took a fancy to me.
He nodded his head in the direction of the incredibly hairy pygmy.
And I can't let you out because you guys are an offering to their god. And also some sort of wedding ritual.
What?
Eric and Attila shot, each crawling to the edge of the cage closest to Evan.
A wedding?
A sacrifice?
What are you talking about? Since when do you speak their language?
Will there be cake?
Evan pulled a face as he leaned farther in.
To be honest, I have no idea what's really going on.
Val let out another dry laugh. Evan ignored him and continued.
I'm just making it up on the fly. You guys gotta get me out of here. I don't want to be hitched to Henrietta Smells Bad over there. And in case you hadn't noticed, she ain't no looker either. Also, I'd rather not spend the next couple of months chowing down on my friends.
The daughter looped her arm around Evan's, ushering him away. Evan shot a terrified look over his shoulder and mouthed the words, "Save me." Attila waved and said in a low voice so Evan wouldn't hear,
Man, they are gonna have some ugly kids.
The chief climbed atop a stone plinth that had been erected before the cages. His hairy face was hidden behind a cracked but repaired mask. He began chattering at the rest of the village in a grand, slow voice, with lots of drawn-out pops and whistles. Pygmies began to emerge from their homes, listening intently as he began to wave his hands frantically, gesturing wildly between the cages and the fire. His words were drowned out by the outcry of whoops and hollers from the crowds of small people. They were cheering as they dropped their previous duties, donned their own wooden masks, and began leaving their homes en masse. Some heaped their entire families on the backs of boars, plucking up spears as they ambled around the village square, jeering and chanting. Evan walked up beside the cages, looking around. He had been reluctantly dressed for the occasion. They had outfitted him with a leaf garment, feather and flower petal bindings, and smears of beetle dye along his bare arms. He was holding a newly carved mask between nervous hands as he looked back at Eric.
Oh, that can't be good.
Get us out of here,
Eric urged, reaching to grab his tiny friend and shake some sense into him. The chief's daughter slapped Eric's hand away before pulling Evan back.
Oh, sorry, looks like I gotta,
he said, pulling against her attempts to dislodge him.
I don't have a choice. I'm sure the four of yous can figure out an escape on your own. Just hurry up and rescue me.
Evan was now being dragged away by the chief and his daughter, who were both chatting happily at one another.
Talk about cold feet,
Attila murmured, before jumping right back into his escape plan involving jerky. And then their cages began to move. The structures had been tethered to two large hippodials, and Brigg was being ushered along behind them by no less than 20 pygmies, each with a spear held dangerously close to his skin. The sound of profanities told Eric that they had cut his brother down from his cage and were dragging him along behind Brigg. This was it. They were about to be sacrificed to an unknown god in the middle of a rainforest on an unknown world. He sighed and slumped back against his cage. The beasts hauled the cages up the side of the pyramid, tossing the prisoners about as they ascended each stone step, until eventually the trip was over. The cages slid easily into place atop the flat zenith of the structure, the wedding party and the churning crowd close in tow. There, at the center of the stone peak, were two massive carved deity figures. Stone boars stood facing one another, tusks jutting upwards to support an ivory altar. It had been stained brown from the years of sacrifices, and the bones of those offered up to the gods littered the ground. Most of them were insect exoskeletons, or bird bones, an occasional animal jaw, and there were even a few pygmy-sized skulls among the debris.
Holy cannoli!
Attila shouted, lurching against the edge of his cage.
Yes, we get it. We're all gonna die,
Eric replied apathetically. He kept his gaze down at his feet, unwilling to look around at the carnage any further.
No! Look!
Is that?
Val asked, shaking off an overzealous pygmy guard.
It is.
Eric looked up. Between the cheering hands and tossing of leaves and flower petals against the altar, he could just make out the swirling colors between two giant boar carvings. His heart skipped a beat as he jumped in his cage.
A gateway!
Attila began hopping for joy, paying no mind every time his head smashed into the top of his cage.
We found the way out!
Val sighed a little.
Yeah, we just have to avoid dying long enough for all of us to make it through. Any ideas?
Eric looked around.
What we need is a distraction.
As if on cue, an ear-shattering sound crashed through the jungle. It was deafening and thunderous, a loud roar of anger and rage. Birds were scattered into the skyline as trees began to rumble and crack in the distance. Attila grinned.
Boy, we sure are lucky.
And then came the voice, distant but clear.
I will find you, even if I have to tear this forest apart to do so. There is nowhere I cannot track you.
Attila let out a nervous chuckle, wilting against the death glare Val was giving him. An anxious chatter rose among the pygmies. They glanced in the direction of the noise, pointing their spears towards the forest. The chief climbed atop the altar and frantically gestured at the shaman to hurry up with the ceremony. Garbed in a pale barkskin dress, the hairy princess pushed Evan into position before the altar.
Whoa! Hey, don't you think there's something a bit more pressing?
The crashing from the forest grew louder.
We need to get through that portal, and now,
Val ordered, trying to stand.
Evan, stop messing around and get us loose.
Believe me, I'm trying.
Evan was recoiling and doing his best to avoid kissing the bride, but she proved to be far stronger than him in the end. The tree line at the outskirt of the village exploded in a shower of splintered wood, and Alpha stepped forward into the clearing.
I will find you!
He still had the general shape of something human-ish, but rage apparently made it hard for him to hold his form together, as he had a few extra gooey appendages and was sprouting inky tentacles. The pygmies began rushing about, shouting and screaming at one another as Alpha began ripping their tree houses from the ground, roots snapping violently in protest. He scanned the clearing back and forth, scouring his surroundings for them. Eric paled as he felt the portal locker in his pocket give a heavy pulse, and Alpha's eyes locked onto his. Animals began to flee as the ground shook. The hippodiles tore off down the far side of the pyramid, followed closely by several other boars. They trampled anything in their path: pygmies, the altar, each other, and even the cages. Eric put his hands over his head to keep from being crushed, waiting for the stampede to subside. When silence fell around them, he looked up. The pygmies had all fled into the forest on the opposite side of the pyramid, leaving the 5 of them alone with a flabbergasted chief and a hairy princess trying desperately to love on Evan. The carved boar statues had been toppled, the altar lay on its side, and the bones were scattered about them.
Oi! Quit your gawking and get moving!
Evan shouted, managing to extricate an arm free to wave at Val. Attila stomped up to the overwhelmed little chief, snatched the hat off his furry head, and gave him a disapproving glare.
Get your own hat!
He shoved the hat, still covered in leaves and gold, back on his head with an inward, satisfied grin. The sound of stone being crushed and swept aside became more cacophonous as Alpha charged towards them. Birds were calling as they fled from the canopy, adding to the deafening commotion as he roared in triumph. Briggs snapped the bindings around his wrists as if they were dental floss, and reached down to disentangle Eric from the broken rubble of his cage. Vel managed to pull the princess off Evan, setting her down to the still bewildered chief. Evan gave her a quick smile before he darted through the portal, calling back as he went.
Sorry, doll. I'm just not ready for that kind of commitment.
The rest of the group followed behind him, disappearing through the swirling vortex, one after the other. The ground trembled with each thunderous step Alpha made as he reached the foot of the pyramid. He would catch them and squeeze the life from their bodies before prying the device from their cold, dead fingers. He nearly flew up the side of the structure in his haste, using his extra appendages to propel him forward. But at the peak, he found only toppled idols and altars, scattered bones and offerings, 2 sobbing little pygmies, and a gateway. A gateway that began shifting colors as it was changed from the other side. The chief had managed to drag away his daughter just in time to avoid the rage-induced fit Alpha was throwing. He wrenched the boar statues off the ground, heaving them over the side of the pyramid, and flung the altar as hard as he could, watching it disappear into the forest. He took a deep breath, willing himself to be calm. He would need to concentrate to feel out where they had gone, and anger would only impede his process. There was nowhere they could go that he would not be able to find them. Of Monsters and Mushrooms, an ongoing series by Lesley Herron, is a crossover fanfiction mixing her own characters and settings with a few of those created by author J.D. Wiley. She writes for the fun of devising new ways of messing with her characters and seeing just how much trouble they can get into.
Do you mind? I'm trying to concentrate. If you want such a low-level life form, I would eat you. Shut up. Look, I'm sorry. Listen, there's other fish in the sea. You'll meet someone else. A nice monkey thing. Do you need a tissue?